Admittedly, this feels like a bit of a weird request because I've talked about Oblivion and the Elder Scrolls series so much in my videos, in my streams. I did a whole series of 50 episodes of the game. I mean, for goodness sakes, it feels like I'm going to be very repetitive in the things I'm going to say here. But it was requested by a patron to go ahead and do an Oblivion episode. And admittedly, I always said I was going to do an Oblivion Rumination once I actually finished the roleplay, since that would serve as my replay of Oblivion in order to do so with. So here we are. Technically a week late, but scheduling issues, and well, let's just say that I'm struggling to even keep up with my schedule right now, let alone actually trying to get ahead of myself, especially with all the real life crap going on. So let's just jump right into this. First of all, I gotta say, I was someone who enjoyed the Elder Scrolls series up until Morrowind, at which point I fell in love with it. While Arena and Daggerfall were interesting, and things that I enjoyed playing, I have never actually gone back to play them, and to be perfectly blunt, have never really had any interest or desire to do so. That's nothing against the games, it's just they were good for their time, and then we moved on. A proper remake of them might be interesting, but I'd much rather have a proper remake of Morrowind, which again brings me back to my point. Morrowind was amazing! And yet, as I've said many times on my stream, Morrowind is one of those games I have difficulty going back to right now, mostly because of a combination of graphics, UI, and gameplay. There are some gameplay things that are just plain annoying about Morrowind to go back to. When I was sitting down and thinking about the differences between Morrowind and Oblivion, I was actually surprised how many there were. And all of it actually comes down to the same basic concept. Freedom and storytelling, okay? Let me explain what I mean by this. I've often said that a game that is too sandbox, too open world, too free in what you can do in it is kind of boring, because most of the time that comes at the expense of what I refer to as content, developer-generated content, to make my term clear. And so I see a game like, I'm going to name drop one here, Evocron Mercenary, which is not a bad game, but I was so bored playing it that I just couldn't bring myself to do so past a single day. It was so dull to me. I mean, there's tons to do, but it's all purely user-generated, player-generated, etc. It is a total sandbox, so it's a little too extreme in that direction for me personally. Now, Morrowind was not too extreme, but there is no denying Morrowind was definitely more towards the sandbox side than most open-world RPGs have ever been. It is arguable that, not counting the really old stuff, and there are some exceptions there which I'm not going to name drop, Morrowind is one of the better examples of a truly open-world game. In other words, you get dropped off the boat, make your character do the tutorial, and then do whatever. However, I've always felt that the reason Morrowind excels at that is because it is not truly open like Evocron Mercenary is. There are directions, there are quests, there is a lot of actual developer-generated content. But when I talk about the freedom, it's hard to explain fully what I mean by this. I've talked about this on the stream extensively. For example, your quest journal in Morrowind would take notes of things that happened as they happened. So in other words, if you talk to this guy and this guy and this guy, get their 3 quests, your journal would look like, this guy wants me to do this guy wants me to do this guy wants me to do this, in that order. But then if you did something for the second guy, the first guy, and the third guy, it would be second note, first note, third note. It's in chronological order, right? Yes, I know Tribunal fixed this a bit, but I know a lot of people who had significant issues with Morrowind's quest journal, to the point where some people just didn't use it. And yes, I count myself in that group as well. I actually had a pad of paper at the side of my desk, which is admittedly something I enjoy doing, just scribbling notes like, okay, I gotta go to this area. And by God, you better pay attention to directions, because another thing that Morrowind didn't have, and some people seem to forget this, is it had no quest tracking. If you don't know what I mean, a lot of games in the modern era have a concept where you need to go to this area or to this target or this whatever. This is where your next objective is. And there's like a thing on the map or a thing on your radar or whatever telling you, at least in the very least, a direction of where that is, which can be intrusive to the point where it's like, you should go, here's a giant arrow. Sometimes it can be rather subtle. Sometimes it's not even accurate, blah, blah, blah. That wasn't in Morrowind as well. Furthermore, there were several other things in Morrowind that go to this freedom thing. For example, Mark and Recall, the spells. For those of you who have not played it, Mark is you cast it, and wherever you're standing is now marked. When you cast Recall, you go back to that spot. The levitate spell, which was actually required for several points in the game. I'm notably thinking about the Telvanni, certain areas there, was something that was completely taken out because, well, for obvious reasons, really. They didn't want you to go into certain areas because they didn't want to overload the engine, because Oblivion, especially at the time, but even nowadays, is kind of a beast of a game when it comes to how much of your computer it eats up. There were no essential NPCs in Morrowind. Now, that sounds like a weird change, and I know this is a very divisive topic, because some people like essential NPCs and some people don't. There are pluses and minuses to both ideals. The plus to no essential NPCs is obvious: freedom. You can attack or pickpocket or destroy or kill or whoever the heck you want, and you have that total freedom. Which, of course, comes with the automatic negative that you have total freedom to completely screw up quest chains or future events or whatever, because you just killed an NPC who's part of that quest chain, which you didn't even know about. Furthermore, essential NPCs can be frustrating as a negative because, there's this person who I cannot kill because of blah, but at the same time, if there's someone you're escorting or someone you want to deal with a quest, it makes it much easier to do so if they can't die, because as several people who've played Morrowind can tell you, more than once there was someone who you wanted to live who could get randomly aggroed by whatever. And there's a lot of ways this can happen. I've seen guards accidentally attack an NPC. I've seen some enemies roam into town and end up killing several quest NPCs and stuff like that. And of course, you can kill NPCs completely by accident. So, without even meaning to, just because you were swinging and they happen to get in your way. So the fact that there are some NPCs you can't kill, I'm with that. But again, it can be frustrating because sometimes you really want to, or you're just irritated at someone and they're just, you get where this is going. It's a plus-minus system, and I'm just commenting on it there. There's other things. In Morrowind, there was no such thing as key doors. For those of you who don't know what that means, it's a door and or a lever or switch or whatever that cannot be operated except by scripting, which usually means actually interacting with something, or by having a specific key on you. In Morrowind, if you had lockpicking cranked, you could unlock and open everything in the whole world. Now, there were keys, and you could do that, but it made more optional, which made more of that freedom thing. And yet, for all of that stuff, Oblivion has several things that I think are definitively net positives. Net positives. There are negatives still attached here. For example, schedules. For those of you who don't know, in Morrowind, NPCs didn't have schedules. At best, they had patrol routes. They would be like, or if they felt like being fancy. For those of you who don't know this, all three of you, in Oblivion, every even moderately important NPC, including most of the minor NPCs, and NPCs who have nothing to do with anything, no quests, no real special dialogue, just every NPC has a schedule. At 3 a.m. they go here, they sit here and they eat their meal, and then they go here. They have a routine, they have a daily interaction that they go with. That also includes weekly, by the way. Some NPCs on every Tuesday or equivalent, or Wednesday or equivalent, will go to this other town, actually take a trip through the wilds in order to go to this other town, or sometimes they'll go to a different place than normally, or maybe they'll go fishing, or maybe they'll just go and stare out at this area, or they'll go to this particular location what happens to be important to them, etc. The schedule system which Oblivion added adds so much life to the world. And while some people may find that frustrating, and I see why, because it means that at certain points in the day and night you can't simply quest or advance a quest like you want to because they're sleeping, or they're eating, or they're not where they usually are, because they're doing their daily routine. So you have to actually find them. For me personally, I love that because it adds so much immersion and it adds so much flavor to the world. Makes it feel more like a world than it does a game. And that's important in a game with exactly 7 voice actors. I know there's a little more than 7, but you get my point. Random NPC interactions. I forget what they called it. It was like the Radiant system or something like that, which they were so proud of. Let me make it clear that I think they should have been proud of this AI system, especially at the time when Oblivion came out. This was genuinely impressive. It has been mocked and derided for years because it's silly, and it doesn't actually work perfectly, but the fact that it works at all, in my opinion, is genuinely impressive. You'll still see sometimes where 2 NPCs will walk up to each other, and one of them will say, "Hi, I don't want to talk to you. Okay, bye." Bye. And that's the extent of their conversation, or other similarly stupid stuff. And yet every now and again you'll see a conversation that's actually really cool and actually sheds some light onto the world or the feelings of the people. I'll never ever forget this one incident. Forgive me for sharing. There was a Khajiit thief. I don't remember his name. I want to say it was in Skingrad. And he was sneaking. Now, of course, I can see him, because when an enemy sneaks, they don't actually go invisible like you do. They're just crouching. So I see him sneaking up and steal something from the stall. And now he got caught by the guards, and the guards went on this epic chase to go after him because an NPC can't surrender to go to jail like you can. So all they can do is effectively default to the resist arrest option. And it got so bad that some of the guards actually accidentally hit a couple of other NPCs, which attacked back, and it just went all over the place. And I just loved watching that because I had nothing to do with that. I didn't invoke that. It was not part of the game. It was just the random AI interacting with the other random AI, and I loved that. Now again, that doesn't always work all that well, and of course I also just kind of idly mentioned one of the other things that irritates me about this game, but whatever. Let's talk about another thing, though. There's no mutually exclusive factions in Oblivion. Again, whether this is a positive or negative is going to depend on your opinion. For those of you who don't remember, back in Morrowind, there were several. In fact, there were more factions overall for you to join. However, it is worth noting that you had less quests, less content, and less story to those factions. For the most part, the story aspect of those factions in Morrowind was kind of lackluster. It was mostly about you becoming powerful and gaining this and maybe learning a little bit more about the story or the characters, and that was it. Whereas in Oblivion, there are less factions, but more quests, more content, and they are extremely story-focused. I have a whole section I'll be talking about later just about the factions and their story quests. So that, in my opinion, that is a huge positive, even though they got rid of the mutually exclusive thing. Now, if they added the mutually exclusive thing, I think that'd be great, as long as it didn't detract from the existing, like if that was added on top of. Here's a DLC. Merchant gold is another thing that they changed. For those of you who don't remember, back in Morrowind, if a merchant had 500 gold, they had 500 gold, not 500 gold was their max purchase price. Once you sold a single item for 500 gold, they were out of money. This led to several irritating circumstances where you had to do this whole bartering game in order to basically get the merchant to have enough gold in order to purchase something you wanted to sell that was of sufficient value. And considering the highest merchant in the game, without mods, had 10 grand on him, and trust me, you got stuff that's worth way more than 10 grand in Morrowind, it could be a little frustrating getting a hold of some gold supply in that game. By contrast, Oblivion has that as their gold supply. If he has 500 written there, he can buy anything up to 500 gold, but that gold never moves. That's just his limit, his buy limit. And that can be raised by several things, too. Several times, I might add. And of course, there's one other thing Oblivion did. Well, there's two other things. Let's talk about the first thing first. Morrowind had Argonians actually having the legs they should. Damn it. And Argonians haven't had the proper legs since. My poor Argonian. Anyways, all joking aside, the other big thing before I go into the finale here of the comparison between Morrowind and Oblivion is that Oblivion added a physics engine. A pretty good physics engine, actually, all things considered. I've talked about this like 50 times, forgive me for repeating, but I will never ever forget the first time I ever loaded up this game. Gary was sitting right next to me, and we went up to that bucket. You know the one, don't you? When in the very beginning, at the tutorial, you're going through the sewers and the escape tunnels, and you go to the side area, and it's tutorial. No, here's how a bow works, here's how a sword works, there's a rat, and there's a bucket hanging over a thing. And we started we spent so much time just sitting there, grabbing the bucket and letting it go, putting an arrow into the side, which changed the weight and the value so the bucket started leaning, putting a couple other arrows into the side so it would lean more. We spent so much time dealing with that. Not just as physics geeks and programming geeks, which both Gary and I were, but just for the enjoyment of the fact that we could do that and mess around like that in the game. That also is why Oblivion is literally the only game ever that I've genuinely enjoyed archery in. Because I'm damn good at it. I actually have, used a bow and string now and again for several years in real life, and it's something that I've always really enjoyed. And it's one of those things that just flows naturally. The trajectory calculation, wind differential, etc. It just kind of happens for me. I've always been very good at it, and that translated very well into Oblivion because the physics engine was so well designed. Obviously, there's no wind current, and there's a couple of things that you don't have to take into account. But overall, you could do that trajectory thing, and it will pretty much go the trajectory it should. And I love that. I've demonstrated this several times, and there's several times where I'll pull back and I'll be like, you know what? I bet I can hit that guy. And the only thing that prevented me from hitting him is that in Oblivion, after a certain range, projectiles despawn. I was literally trying to hit someone that was physically impossible to hit. I'm pretty sure I could have hit him otherwise, though. Oblivion overall, though, is, in my opinion, the best of the Elder Scrolls series. I know that's kind of a controversial opinion, because most people tend to prefer either Skyrim or Morrowind. But while Morrowind had an amazing world, and that freedom element I expressed, and Skyrim had a lot of things going for it, including several convenience features and a really streamlined leveling system, and a few other tidbits about this gameplay fixed, in my opinion, Oblivion really hits the sweet spot. It is still a very open world. Really, it is. You get out of that sewers, go do whatever. You want to leave the main quest and never do it? You can. You want to just go and randomly explore? You can. You want to fast travel? You can. You want to ignore fast travel? You can. You want to use the quest journal? You can. You want to ignore the quest journal? You can. All of those things that were added as convenience features from Morrowind can be ignored, with a few exceptions, like the essential NPCs you can't really ignore, obviously. But you can totally ignore them and play it however you want to, so there is still freedom to it, but now there's convenience features if you don't want to do that. You are literally not forced to be free, as weird as that sounds, and there's much, much more emphasis on storytelling. Obviously, the world of Morrowind is probably one of the most fleshed out setting aspects of the Elder Scrolls setting. I know that sounds weird, but I mean, if you just took it Vanderfell, or Vanderfall if you prefer, that's probably the most fleshed out setting of the various Elder Scrolls games. But as far as characterization, character growth, plot, and theme, Oblivion just knocks Morrowind out of the water, and Skyrim, in my opinion. Again, as I mentioned earlier, every single major quest chain has a significant story element to it. Most of the dinky little quests actually have some good character moments and thematic moments and setting building moments to them. I can't actually think off the top of my head. I'm sure there are some, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head that is just go kill X of Y for no reason. You know, the closest would be the Nirnroot quest, and even the Nirnroot quest is still discussing something that most people probably don't bother to think about, and I don't blame them. But the idea of there literally being something like a Nirnroot, aka something of the Nirn, something that is literally a physical manifestation of the morphic reality that Tamriel really is, and what you could do with that, leading to the creation of the potion, etc. And of course that follows up in Skyrim as well, but I digress. So let's go ahead and move on past the comparisons to the other Elder Scrolls games, and the fact that I love the hell out of this game. And it's also worth noting, while I fully plan on replaying Morrowind whenever I can play it properly, and I fully intend to replay Oblivion, those are the only two that actually have that slot for me. I have no great interest in replaying Skyrim, like, ever. I mean, I'm sure that someday, you know, something like, hey, go play Skyrim. But it's not on my list, so to speak. Whereas, by contrast, I'm actually looking forward to replaying Oblivion someday. And the same is also true with Morrowind. But anyways, crafting. Now, crafting was ludicrously broken in Morrowind. For those of you who don't know, I'll just give you my favorite trick right off the top of my head. Craft a potion that increases your stats to make your potion making better, and you could craft while paused, so it only has to be a 1 second potion. So you just do a few dozen of those till your int is a few thousand, and then you make super ridiculously powerful stuff, and then you're invincible for the rest of the game. And you could do that as early as Balmora, I want to say. Pretty early on, all things considered, if you know what you're doing. That's more part of that freedom thing. Crafting is still broken in Oblivion, just like it is in Skyrim, I might add. However, it is a lot more... It feels like a different kind of broken. Anybody who actually watched my roleplay watched me make spells that could basically one-shot anything. In fact, I think there's very few things that survived one shot of that, up to and including most boss characters, because you can do that. That's mostly, and the fact that you can enchant your armor to ludicrous levels, and the fact that you can repair your stuff on the field, all that kind of stuff. Very, very useful stuff. I'm not sure I would call it essential, though, because I did that rather on purpose, for several reasons, most of which was actually in-character role-playing reasons. I wanted to demonstrate how our Arshangonian had become so drunk and full of his own power that he literally did not consider anything to be a threat to him, which is one of the reasons why he started kind of losing it towards the end there. One of the reasons. There's like 5. But you don't have to do that. Again, that it's optional. You can completely ignore crafting spells. You can completely ignore magic, for that matter. And yet, if you do craft magic, you can basically craft it as strong or as weak as you want. Again, I mentioned that Doom spell of destruction, but that's not actually the best spell I crafted. If you were paying attention, I made a spell which was a buff, which buffed, among other things, my magic, my regen, etc. And so, as soon as I could cast that, I basically had ridiculously high stats and virtually infinite mana. You can do that, or you could tone it down, or whatever. It's up to you. It's your choice. I guess, is that everything I have? Let's go ahead and talk about a few other things. Let's talk about some negatives of Oblivion. This is not a perfect game. It's actually a very flawed game. I love the hell out of it, but I would still admit its flaws. For example, the disposition system is incredibly, amazingly awesome. Like, you would not believe how many factors go into what determines any given NPC's disposition to you. And the fact that every single NPC in the game, that includes enemies, by the way, has a specific disposition value related towards you, and that can be altered by spells or effects or whatever, is incredible. The fact that they put that much time and effort into it is phenomenal. However, the pie chart minigame is stupid. You'll notice I basically never did that in the roleplay. I will basically never do that ever again. It's dumb, poorly implemented, kind of crap, and frankly, I feel like just adding an option to, roll charisma in order to try and improve your dispositions with them, or just give them gold, which admittedly they did have that option, would have worked a lot better than the damn pie chart minigame. Even Bethesda has admitted that they don't really care for the pie chart minigame. Then there's the suicidal AI. See, the AI does not actually have self-preservation coded into it, except under certain circumstances. So it's very likely that certain AIs will basically just run off to attack whatever, even if that whatever is stupidly overpowered for them, even if that brings them in range of your weapons. One of the reasons, if you'll notice, I almost never used an AoE spell in the roleplay, is because AoEs also hit the NPCs. And the NPCs like to rush right up into combat and be like, yeah! It is kind of frustrating, and it's one of the more commonly told jokes in Oblivion that you'll be fighting something, accidentally hit your friend, that you didn't want to hit, and either turn him against you, have him complain at you, or kill him. Which is another reason why essential NPCs can be nice under certain circumstances. Another thing I have a huge complaint about with Oblivion is the level scaling. This is a weird one to talk about. Unlike in... I'm trying to think how to... Let's just put it this way. Not everything actually scales with you. Now, I know that sounds weird, but there are plenty of things that don't scale with you, that have static values. But most of them are not your enemies. They are the NPCs, or the escorts, or whatever. And that can lead to some very serious problems if you get to a certain thing. Like, just to name an example right off the top of my head, if I happen to be level 55, which I believe is the theoretical cap, it might have been 54. I don't think I had actually maxed everything yet. But anyways, 50 plus, and you're escorting, the Emperor, who is effectively level like 10, through a swarm of level 50 enemies, it can be a little harrowing. And so the fact that not everything scales is kind of frustrating, especially because the scaling system in general is a very keep it or love it or hate it kind of a mechanic. I have never known anyone who's just on the scaling system. By all means, correct me in the comments below. I'm sure I'll get 5 people who like to be contrary. I'm looking at UK. And we'll just be like, I was just on it. But the point is, the scaling system is something that a lot of people are like, yes, it's great because the world will always be of a way to challenge me and of a level to challenge me. It'll make me interested. Or, I hate the leveling system. It makes it to the point where everything I do is effectively meaningless and I never feel like I'm actually progressing or getting stronger. Both sides do have points. Ultimately, if I had to vote which side I'm on, I would say I would prefer not to have the level scaling, to be completely blunt. Mainly because it does basically invalidate the feeling of progression. I'll be talking about this a little bit more in my Fallout video, which I'll be doing soon-ish, in like a few weeks. But the point is, it just feels like I don't know, it removes the point of leveling in many ways for me. And I know there are other points in leveling, but I'm one of those people who, if I'm going to bother leveling, which I don't always, I'm the kind of guy who likes low-level challenge runs, I've done this before, but if I'm going to bother leveling, I want to do it because I want to get stronger. Like, as in stronger than what's around me, not stronger in an abstract sense. You know, I want to actually be better. Now, I know. The relative power level of the player increases more than the enemies if you're doing your equipment and customization right, but that's exactly my point. You have to be efficient and optimize, because it's actually also possible, if you're leveling badly, and this is very possible in Oblivion, if you're leveling the wrong stats or in the wrong ways, to basically be really good at A, B, C, and D, none of which have anything to do with combat, and the rest of the world is now level 15 and is destroying you. So, Now, one other little thing I want to talk about with the level scaling thing, just briefly. I have been asked more than once, what's the lore explanation for the level scaling? And to be perfectly blunt, there technically isn't one, except there was one that was hazarded by a Bethesda employee. I don't remember who, don't ask, this was years ago. And I've heard it cycled around several times and misquoted and whatnot. I don't even know the full truth myself. I only share the theory with you now. And that is that as the world is getting culled by you, the rest of the world is getting stronger. It's literally a survival of the fittest thing. The bandits you see are stronger because the weaker bandits were killed off, and the only bandits who survived were the ones who were stronger. And then, same thing with the Daedra escalating, same thing with the animals, etc. It's an interesting theory and kind of fits the sort of morphic reality that Tamriel is, but shrug. Of course, all of this, every complaint I have about this game is solvable by one word: mods. I would not even be surprised if some people have not reached this point of the video and already went to the comments and say, well, that is invalid because this mod fixed it. Make no mistake, this game gets full credit for having full mod support. It's actually, even to this day, it is still rare to see a game that has full mod support. Let me explain what that means really quick. It's not just a game that is built with the idea of modding in mind. See Dragon Age Inquisition for an example of the exact opposite of what I'm talking about. But a game that is built with moddable format in a design to be modded, which in other words means modular, to actually go back to the root word. In other words, the game is designed to be modular. The game is designed to have content added to it over time. They do that on purpose, not just for the modding community, but for their own DLCs and expansions that can just which are effectively mods, just very large, very expensive mods. With a few exceptions, of course, Shivering Isles being the big one. And so when you do that, you have this super modular thing. That's nice. That's great. There's plenty of games that do that. Then they took this next step. This is something Bethesda's always been great at. And they say, here are the dev tools. They actually give the players all the tools that the developers themselves have, with some exceptions, in order to actually have full access to the game itself. They did this with Fallout 3 as well, and New Vegas and whatnot. And it's something that Bethesda games in general, which I do count New Vegas as one, even though Bethesda didn't make it, have always been very good at. So huge props to that. I cannot emphasize how amazing that is enough, because even though there are dozens upon dozens of terrible mods and awful mods and cheat mods and nude mods and all sorts of other crap, there are also amazing mods and incredible mods and new content mods and new storyline mods and new mechanics mods, and here's an airship, and here's the ability to teleport, and here's, let's change how vampires work, and here let's customize how this is, and here's so much has been done. It has been argued over the years which is the most modded of the various Bethesda games. I would say personally that even though it is a close tie between several other games, Oblivion is still to this day one of the most modded games, arguably in history. And there's a good reason for that. It kind of exploded at a good time for that. One other thing I feel like noting before we move on past gameplay section here is that Oblivion and Bethesda in general have always been pretty good about console support, which I'm actually fully in favor of. Obviously, I just praised the modding, which until recently was not a thing for consoles. However, the fact that you could play Oblivion on a 360 or whatever is good. I like that. I like the fact that it means more people can play this game. I know that people make this joke all the time. No master race here of any time. No console wars, no nothing. If you have this great game and it's out on like 5 systems, that's awesome. I think that's great, because that means people who only own that system, or that system, or that system, can still play it. So that was another great thing. I'll be talking about that as well when I start that KOTOR lore run, hopefully soon. Anyways, one last thing though, I swear. DLCs and expansions. Now, most people don't remember, but nowadays the very term DLC has become a bad word. Now, I don't want to get into this exact discussion right here and now. This is not an appropriate time to talk about it. I'm only mentioning this to give some historical context. Oblivion was one of the very first games to come out with DLC, described as such. It was actually called DLC. You could argue what's been DLC or not before that. That's a matter of technicalities and definitions, and frankly, I don't care. Oblivion actually said this is the Horse Armor DLC, and it was advertised as such, and it was projected as such, and it was one of the first widespread DLCs you could buy. And people were so pissed about it. They were so upset. Why would I spend money on a mod that gives my horse armor that's purely cosmetic and with a little bit of gameplay value? I mean, what the hell? You would not believe the stink people made about that. I mention that because nowadays DLC has become such a dirty word that even a game that has good DLC, and there are several, is usually they have to overcome that stigma of the fact that it is DLC in order to sell it. It's like, we know it's DLC, but wait, look! Look, it's actual content. It's got actual additional stuff to say. Please, please, don't judge us too harshly. Well, you know. Let me give you a safe example. Fantasy Life. A game on the 3DS has a DLC, which is tons of new content, and it's effectively an expansion, really. But tons of new content, tons of additional stuff, and yet they had to, like, really finagle around what they advertised it as and be like, you know, here. Because people were like, I don't know, I don't like DLC because I don't like DLC. And again, I don't want to get off on that topic too much. I mention this because one of the other interesting things about Bethesda games is the content they push out tends to toe the line between DLC and expansion. Now, for me, I've always defined expansion and DLC as a difference in amount of content. Nothing else. They're both effectively the exact same thing. The only difference is a DLC has less and an expansion has more. For example, Tribunal and Blood Moon were without question expansions. Shivering Isles was without question an expansion. But I've known several people debate as to whether or not, for example, Knights of the Nine is a DLC or an expansion. Most people would agree that, for example, Fighter Stronghold and the Thieves' Den and the Mage's Tower, and I can't remember, the Orrery, all that stuff is DLCs because it's small scale, right? And so is the horse armor. But expansion, you know, it's kind of a vague thing, and Bethesda's always towed that line. They did that in Fallout 3 as well. I've heard lots of people debate which of the Fallout 3 add-ons were expansions or DLCs. This is also true in Skyrim, with the two they pushed out there. I only mention it for, again, just kind of a historical context and interesting thing, but it is worth noting that, with the exception of the horse armor, Bethesda's always been good about their DLC. Whatever you define it as, DLC, expansion, it's almost always worth getting to some extent or another. And that's good. And that has especially been good in this game. And, you know, I like that. I like the fact that, you know, I could buy that with, except for the horse armor, I could buy all this stuff and be like, yeah, tons of awesomeness. Or at the very least, some awesomeness. Okay, let's take a drink. Let's talk about story stuff. Now, I'm not going to be talking about all of the story of Elder Scrolls. That would take me years. I know a decent amount about it, too. I'm also not going to talk about all the story of Oblivion. That would also take me a long time. What I decided to do was I have my notes here. There's like 8, 10, something like that, notes here. These are the things that I felt were interesting to discuss, things worth mentioning, things I wanted to talk about. And indeed, as ever, feel free to comment or share your own thoughts on these things. I do read all my comments, as ever, and I do appreciate that. One of the things I find most interesting about Oblivion, and I kind of talked about this as an aside in the roleplay, is this is especially true, and again, we're going to push the rest of the Elder Scrolls series out for a second. We're just going to focus in on Cyrodiil, and the Cyrodiil that is presented in Oblivion, aka not the jungle rainforest that was mentioned in other games. There are explanations for that in lore, by the way, if you're curious. Value of life. It seems that while nobody is outright... I mean, the overall... It's not like this barbaric, horrible state where everyone is constantly killing and destroying everything around them. However, it does seem that there's this sort of, forgive me for the word, jaded atmosphere in Cyrodiil, to the point where a death is certainly something to be, you know, and is a negative. But it's kind of the equivalent of a real life of stubbing your toe really badly. It's like, oh, jeez, oh, that stings, oh, whatever, frickin' person who's dead. It really does seem equivalent. The value of life seems so low in Oblivion, in Cyrodiil. The fact that you can actually pay a few hundred or thousand gold for killing someone and basically get away scot-free with it just really speaks volumes to how much people don't care about that kind of sanctity or any other such thoughts of that matter. It also speaks very much of the Elder Scrolls setting in general, and always has, because it's one of those weird things where most people don't understand just how dangerous and wild the Elder Scrolls setting really is, despite seeming like a rather urban or domesticated setting. It really isn't. It is still very dangerous, still very violent, and there's still a lot of horrible things going on in it. There's a reason why there are two major assassins guilds, both of which are competing regularly, and one of which is actually legitimized by official governments. You know, that's the kind of world this is, and I just find that fascinating. It also kind of sheds an interesting light onto the arena back in the Imperial City. Obviously, see, the funny thing about the arena is, on the one hand, okay, go fight. You know, it's obviously optional. There's no hints anywhere of anything that say that there are people who are tossed into the arena as punishment. There's no such thing as being pushed there through political pressure or anything like that. You sign up for the arena, you fight. If you win, you get paid. What is so underplayed, and this ties into this beautifully, it's so underplayed, most people don't acknowledge or think about or otherwise put any emphasis on the fact that if you lose, you die. The arena matches are to the death. Think about that for a moment. You could be some random Joe who's just trying to make do, or maybe get some money together to buy some inventory to set up a shop, right? So you decide to fight in the arena, go out there, and you die. Your life is over. Forfeit. Ended. Nobody will even blink an eyelash at that, because that's just the way that life is valued, or rather not valued, in this setting. It's just interesting to think about it that way. This is not trying to be like judgmental or anything like that. It's just interesting to think about. Let's talk about the Daedra. Now, I could talk for hours about the Daedra, just about the Daedra, and my theories on the way they work. One of my strongest theories, I actually mentioned this during the roleplay, because I decided that the Argonian, at certain points in time, basically had insights into the way things worked, which obviously I don't know if this is the way it works, but since it's my theory, I decided to go ahead and make it true in my roleplay. Make sense? The idea here being that the Daedra, the Daedric lords specifically, are basically anchors for reality. Each one of them adheres to their own platform, their own portfolio, right? And yet, at the same time, they are limited to that. And then we see this, most especially in Sheogorath twice, but we do see this in general across the overall perspective of the Daedric Lords across the series, especially in this game, because you are bound to be how it is you are supposed to be, in other words. And there's hints, although very minor hints, that Daedric Lords can and have shifted people more than once. Obviously, there are at least 2 Sheogoraths that we know about, but how many others of the other Daedric Lords have there been? Because each new Lord, and we've seen this, takes on the title and persona and otherwise appearance of the previous one. And it makes sense if you think about it, because they're not taking, they're not becoming a doppelganger of their predecessor. They're becoming conformed to what the role requires. It's a little more metaphysical thing. In other words, a Daedric Lord effectively has no actual individual identity. Their name is their title, their position. And, Sheogorath, for example, madness, dementia, mania, etc., being the anchor of that sort of creative and destructive and violent and crazy aspect of life, of all of the various planes of Oblivion and of the Nirn. I might be using the wrong word there, but the world, the planet. And so and this theory is something that I've always felt the games support a lot, especially given the way that one of the things that the Daedric Lords do very often is they basically don't really fight each other or push to each other in any real fashion. They are all content to let the other Daedric Lords exist. They may bicker or argue or send their minions against their minions, but they'll never actually directly confront any of the others. Now, you could argue for reasons why that exists, but for me, the reasoning has always been that they know that the others have to exist. They are one of the anchors of reality. It would actually be interesting if you think about it, because it makes you, with the whole Gigalog situation, spoiler alert, it makes you wonder if his absence was one of the reasons that the last few eras have been so odd. And his presence is one of the reasons why Skyrim is now so terrible, because now order has been added to the mix, as it should have been from the beginning. Or maybe order isn't being tainted by madness. Who knows? There's several different ways to interpret that. But there is no denying the fact that the Daedra are unique in their presentation, because they are effectively outsiders, to use the D&D term, outer plane creatures. They reconstitute basically infinitely. I'm not even sure if there is a way to permanently destroy a Daedra. I'm not aware of any such thing. However, they also always have a fascinating interest with the material plane. Just like outsiders, I might add. They heap scorn, and they're like, "Oh, mortals, you're so beneath me." And yet, all the time, all the Daedric and Daedric lords, all the Daedra and Daedric lords, go out of their way constantly to interact with Tamriel, with the world. And there's a lot of reasons you could look into that and think about why that is. But personally, I think it's ultimately the fact that, how do I put this? It's the only thing they can actually do. Anything they do in their plane is fully restricted by their limits, their rules, their world. Sheogorath himself, again, has a nice speech about that. And so they are extremely hampered and limited in what they can do there, because they have to confine themselves to their particular rhetoric. Now, of course, they still have to do that on Tamriel, but the people they're working through on Tamriel are not their slaves. They are not their sycophants. They're people who, some of them are. But the point is, they can have unpredictability. They can have randomness. They can have unaltered results. They can change the balance of things. They can alter the way things work, because they're not adhered to the rules, like the Daedric lords are and the Daedra are. That's why I feel so many of the lords have always had such interest in mortal agents rather than using their own Daedra, because even though their Daedra are debatably better in every way, their Daedra are also limited in every way. See where I'm going with this? Again, this is all theories. But the other theory, and this kind of ties into this, is the aedra. I may be pronouncing that wrong. I may even be using the wrong word. I am, of course, referring to the 9 divines. Now, the 9 divines we know almost nothing about. One of the things that Bethesda has always been very good about is basically not telling us anything about the divines. We know a lot about the Daedric lords and the way they work and the way they function. Tons of stuff to speculate on there. We know almost nothing about the 9, or the 8, or whatever you want to call it. My biggest theory is, and always has been, the fact that they are, in fact, Daedric lords themselves. What they are Daedric lords of, debatable, but then again, if you notice, they do all have their own things. Mercy, mercantilism, courage, that kind of thing. So, if you notice, and I haven't done a one-to-one, I should do this at some point, I don't think there's any real overlap between the anchors, the pillar points of what the Daedric lords represent and what the divines represent. They may all actually, no overlap. They may actually still fit congruently with each other. But there is another theory about that, and I'm going to go ahead and use this to segue into my next point. Whether or not Menkar Cameron was correct is something that people have been debating for years, ever since Oblivion came out. We still don't actually know. Is Tamriel actually one of the planes of Oblivion? Was it separated by the divines? Was the whole thing did the whole thing with Lorcan actually happen, etc.? We don't know. He could have just been spouting hot air, or he could have been wrong, or he could have been insane, or any combination of the above. We don't know. Personally, however, I've always felt that he was absolutely correct. It explains a lot of things about the way Tamriel works, especially the following, which I'm now, again, this is where I'm tying this in. What if Tamriel, the reason, okay, I mentioned earlier my theory that the divines are Daedra. Well, if that's true, why don't they have more of a presence? The Daedric lords have never hidden from anybody. They have shrines all over the place. They have no problem communicating with people, even personally in some circumstances. They have no problem, actually physically making a presence and making themselves known. There's no ambiguity there. You know Sheogorath exists because he's right there and he's talking to you. It's a lot more debatable with the divines. The divines have always been a more faith-based thing. We think they're there, we know there's certain powers that come from them, so there is evidence that they exist, kind of, yet not really. Kind of a weird situation. What if the aedra have gone out of their way to do what the Daedric lords have not? What if they claimed this plane of Oblivion jointly, which has never been done elsewise, and then agreed in order to allow it to flourish and grow on its own, to allow it to flourish and grow on its own. What I mean by that is, I mentioned earlier that, a Daedric Lord would use a mortal on Tamriel as their agent, rather than one of their own mortals or their own Daedra, because those guys would be limited. That's because anyone actually living on the plane a Daedric Lord is manifested on, it is their plane, whether they know it or not, is basically being adhered to the doctrine of that Daedric Lord. There's a reason why the Shivering Isles look the way they do. There's a reason the Cold Harbor looks the way it does. Literally, the landscape and the terrain and the people and the animals all literally, physically change, as well as mentally and spiritually and energy-wise and whatever else, actually change to adhere to whatever it is that Daedric Lord represents. Now, this is fact. There's no denying this point. This is not theory. So, getting into the theory side of things, what if the aedra said, we're just going to let the world do its own thing? No doctrine, no adherence. You don't have to. We were going to go out of our way to separate ourselves from this world, which is why they don't present themselves and contact themselves, because they can't. They've cut the connection, with only very few tidbits actually maintaining them as connected to the world. Their shrines and the I can't think of the Amulet of Kings being some good examples. There's a few other examples, but you get the point. So they cut themselves off, and Tamriel is the way it is, and all the continents and all the world and all the countries are the way they are, because that was a world that was a blank slate that grew naturally. It would explain why there's so much variance in the world in a setting which ultimately, aside from Tamriel doesn't actually have that much variance as part of a plot point, again, for the reasons I already mentioned in all the Oblivion planes. It would explain why so many things grow in so many different ways. It would explain why so many of the other Daedric Lords seem to be manifested in it. You get where I'm going with this. And I really like that idea, and it also explains so much about so many things. It also makes the ending of Oblivion so much more poignant, because with the Amulet of Kings gone, that's the last physical manifested connecting point. And with as is mentioned in Oblivion, the gate is shut forever. They will never again be able to physically connect to it in the way that they did before to try and merge Tamriel into any given Oblivion plane. Is it not also possible that that's what that would literally be the final physical connection, so the aedra can no longer be functional there as well? Just food for thought. Water. All this snow. It's drying me up. The way the scrolls work. I've talked about this a trillion times. I'm just going to go over this really briefly. The way an Elder Scroll works is, you pick up a scroll and you're blinded by it because you're stupid. The scrolls are integrally tied into the way the world is. They are a wonderfully meta way to explain why you, the player, that the person sitting at the computer or Xbox or whatever, has so many options and different ways that you can do the game. Again, you might say, well, your choices you don't really get that many choices in this game like you would in like a moral choice system, but that's not the point. You don't have to do every quest, you don't have to do everything. You could do some stuff, or you could do this stuff, or you can just do it by destroying this or whatever. You actually have a fairly large amount of freedom for a game that actually doesn't really have a moral choice system. Yes, I know there's fame and infamy, that's not what I'm talking about. So, with a game like this, they explain that by saying that the Elder Scrolls literally, metaphysically, and retroactively change history, centered around you. So that this is the way this Elder Scroll unfolded. Hence the term of the title. The Elder Scrolls series is so called because every hero, in one fashion or another, interacts with at least one scroll during their adventure, which unfolds into the game as it is told. Now, I've always had a theory about this, which I believe strongly in, to the point where I consider it headcanon, that you, the character, more or less literally enter into existence at the moment of the very start of the game. On the boat in Morrowind, when you're on the wagon ride in Skyrim, and of course when you're in the prison cell in Oblivion. You basically manifest into existence there. There's a decent amount of evidence to support this, including the fact that you have basically no history or past whatsoever. And the fact that nobody has any idea who or what you are, and the fact that, and my personal favorite of this is when in Oblivion, there's actually a specific line that says, why is this here? This cell is supposed to be empty. You are there because you were supposed to be there because you wrote the scroll. That's the way this gets kind of metaphysical. See, the Elder Scroll, in my theory, is, well, this is not my theory. This is actually true. The Elder Scrolls are written by the heroes, the player character. The player characters, right? That's not theory. That's stated fact. The hero, the scroll, the event. That's the way that works, right? So the event is the chunk of time, the scroll they interact with, and the hero interacts with the scroll to write that event, okay? So that goes both directions, regardless of time. So again, they write themselves into existence here exist until they encounter the scroll, at which point they write themselves into existence here, and then up until the end of however far it goes. However, it's also worth noting that they don't cease existing. This is pretty strongly shown in two specific cases. We know the Nerevarine did continue on after the Morrowind incident, because he went off to Akaviri. We know that the Champion of Cyrodiil continued on after the Oblivion Crisis, because he became the new Sheogorath. And so we know that even though you can write up to a certain part of the thing, there is a finite point at which it stops, and then you're no longer, nothing that happens is what you wrote. From that point on, what happens is what happens. That's the basic way how the Elder Scrolls work, and my theory to further expound on how the Elder Scrolls themselves work. I've praised that system many times. I love it. It's a great meta way to explain the way the games work. It does make one interesting little thing pop into my head, though. I find myself wondering if the heroes are aware of what they've written into the scroll after, I know, or before, or at any point during which they've written it. And I think the actual answer is that's dependent on you, the player, to determine for yourself. If you watch the roleplay, you notice there was a time which I actually picked up the scroll, and I was just muttering to myself. He was just muttering to himself the whole rest of the time. Basically because what was happening was Archangonian was reading the scroll and writing the scroll as he went, and I name-dropped a few incidents and things that hadn't even happened yet, that I knew I had planned to happen as I was going through that. So for those moments, Archangonian was fully aware of his full breadth of his time from beginning to end there. But both before and after the event, he had no memory or knowledge of using the Elder Scroll, so it was locked in. So he didn't actually know what his fate was, if that makes any sense. That's just my take on it. One of the other interesting things about this series, especially, but this is most strongly emphasized, I think, in Oblivion and Skyrim, is the level of power the Emperor holds in the Empire is huge. They are a dictator in most senses of the word. And that is actually a system that can work really well, believe it or not, when you have a person like Uriel Septim VII on the throne. Because a good leader who does good things and tries to take care of his people and otherwise is going to generally lead to a good empire when they're the ones in control, right? However, if you have a bad leader, some bad things can happen. But it's also arguably worse if you have a weak leader. If you have a weak-willed king, your empire will basically crumble. And we saw that happened with, I forget his name, just prior to and during Skyrim. That was a very weak emperor, and as a result, the entire empire suffered, and it showed. So, I mention this, though, especially because Uriel Septim VII is interesting to me. Always has been. He has actually been a major player in every game except Skyrim, because he dies in Oblivion, obviously. Spoiler alert. And he, it is arguable that the golden age of the Empire across all of its history was in the point of these games. He did so much, not counting the Jaggertharn thing, he did so much to establish and encourage and develop and progress throughout the whole of the continent. Not just Cyrodiil. That it's some genuinely impressive stuff. And there's a reason why trade and negotiation and diplomacy were all pretty much at a high during his reign. It's also worth noting that everything basically went to hell after his fall. Although, that brings me to my next point. See, one of the things that's interesting about the Elder Scrolls series is, unlike most RPGs of some sort, I know this sounds weird. Like, for example, Final Fantasy VI, forgive me for segueing for a moment, was really big on social interactions and the bonds of friendship and fellowship keep people together. That was like the major theme of the game, right? I've talked about this a trillion times. And this tends to be true in a lot of Japanese games in general, emphasis on the whole rather than the individual. Western RPGs tend to focus more on the individual, because that's more the mindset of the Western culture in general. But one of the things the Bethesda games in general have always done has been what I like to call the guy thing. In other words, you are the guy. You are basically the single most powerful thing walking around on the entire planet at any given point in time. And you know it. The continent literally shifts on your shoulders. Now, I'm not saying that as a derogatory, but I mention it because that also extends past the player character. The Elder Scrolls series has always been very big on one person changing a monumental amount of things. Now, the little people matter, don't mistake me. I mean, the world wouldn't be the world without people in it. But much more than most other settings, individuals really make the impact. To use a bit of a contrast here, Warcraft, as weird as this sounds, has much less emphasis on the individual, because no single individual ever really accomplishes something long-term. They're almost anybody who tries is usually a villain and is brought down by a group. And of course that naturally fits a war game, since an individual in a war doesn't really make sense. But you get where I'm going with it. By contrast, Uriel Septim VII, one man, effectively united the continent basically by himself. Yes, he did have help from one other person. You, the player character. Twice, actually. So, take that as you will. I mention this, though, because it's very important to explain what happens next. After Oblivion, it looks like you're effectively heading into a new dawn of a new age. Oh, by the way, Martin was another individual who effectively changed the course of history, just making that point. And he did it without having any power, which really threw our Argonian for a loop. He just could not process that one. The Empire lost Uriel Septim VII, who was an individual who was a continent mover, Martin, continent mover, and the player. This is brilliant when you think about it from the writing perspective, because the Nerevarine, they had to do something with the Nerevarine, because he was stupidly powerful, arguably the strongest of the player characters in the Elder Scrolls series. I've talked about this before. And the Nerevarine left. He went to the Akviri continent. So he's taken care of, and they have a way to tie that in if they ever decide to go out there in the future. But they had to do something to get rid of the champion of Cyrodiil, who was also pretty damn strong, all things considered. So why not get rid of him by forcing him into a new role, basically? Make him take on a new charge, which prevents him from taking care of the empire he has served for so long. A.k.a. making him the new Sheogorath. It's ruddy brilliant when you think about it, because it completely removes him from the equation. It also fits nicely in my theory of the anchor theory of the Daedra. He would know that he has to become the new Sheogorath, because without a new Sheogorath, things are going to start unraveling. So that's his new job, arguably the most important job he could ever have, and yet it means he cannot be back in Cyrodiil to help the Empire through this harsh time. So that leaves us with an Empire with no strong individuals. And look what happened to the Empire in the century following that, with no strong individuals to keep it. We saw how much it just fell and fell and fell into ruin as everything just gets worse and worse and worse. Arguably, the next individual that actually plays any significant role in the story is the Dragonborn. I know that's debatable, but shrug. Another little tidbit here. I've already talked about my theory about the Tamriel Oblivion thing. I just want to mention one other quick theory that I've heard tossed around a lot. I personally think this is true. Jagartharn's motivations are never really explained or expounded upon. He made a mess of things and abused his personal power and sent a thief to have a kid. We meet that kid's grandchild, or child, I should say, in Skyrim, actually. And, blah, 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 blah. Why? What was his motivation? Just for himself? Well, that does make sense, and that's kind of the official explanation, but I've always felt that he was actually acting under orders of Mehrunes Dagon. It makes more sense to me, especially given the Mythic Dawn cult was obviously years in the making, given the level of influence, resources, and power that they have. There's no way they just sprang up overnight. Wouldn't it be interesting if the Mythic Dawn cult had been gathering power for years and years and years at the behest of Mehrunes Dagon, and one of the things that had been done to make that happen, to allow the Blades in the overall country to be less active, was to have the Imperial Simulacra incident happen. It just makes sense to me. I just thought I'd share that where. This is another odd example of an interpretive work. I know I've talked a lot about the interpretive works lately, from Star Wars to Portal to Far Cry 3. The interpretation, though, mostly has to do with the history of Elder Scrolls in general. Weird fact. We know very little about the Elder Scrolls history. Now, I know you're going to contradict me, but let me explain. With very few exceptions, and there are exceptions, with very few exceptions, almost all the history we learn about the world of Elder Scrolls is told in character. Now, that is a hugely important distinction. If there was an out-of-character explanation of the history, that could be taken as read. That is something that the creators of the world have written down, and therefore is what actually happened. But as we've seen in real life a few quadrillion times, and has happened in many fictional universes as well, when the people in the universe are writing about the history of what happened in the universe, it's not always going to be 100% accurate. And there doesn't even need to be intentional malicious intent there, or a desire to change history. People have differing perspectives. People have differing viewpoints, differing opinions. They may not know what actually happened and are just theorizing on it. And so much of the history of Elder Scrolls is all interpretive, because almost all of it comes from those in-game books, which are written in character. This is not a complaint, though. It gives us a wonderful way to, again, immerse ourselves in the world, because we don't know the true history of this world any more than they do. A nice little immersion point. I just wanted to share that. A couple more things here, really quick. Actually, just one more thing, it looks like, based on my notes here, because I already talked about the Sheogorath thing. This is an interesting setting because time magic exists in Oblivion, and it's never really well explored, and it's almost always dangerous. But there's also retroactive time magic in Oblivion, and that's just messed up. And the more you think about it, the more messed up it gets. Probably the single most powerful instance of that is the Grey Fox Cowl and the entire curse that was on the Thieves Guild. Remember, when you finish that quest, the Thieves Guild was always thriving and always had a guild hall at that one location in the Imperial City. Yeah, retroactive time change, because it always was that way, you know? It's just an interesting thing to think about a setting where that kind of retroactive time magic exists at all, let alone is as used as it is. Granted, it's not used all over the place, but it is used with somewhat frequency to the point where you could consider anyone of significant power is at least aware of the possibility of doing that, which really leads some hesitation to certain things. As I mentioned in my Skyrim thing, one of the major plots of the Thalmor was in fact to enact a form of retroactive history changing, even though it would probably erase them from existence too. They didn't care because screw you, you know, blah blah blah. That's kind of a scary thought, isn't it? And it's another one of those reasons where, in most tiers, I would not prefer to be transferred into Elder Scrolls, because at any given point in time, it would be possible for things to just be different and always have been different. I wouldn't even know. Anyways, that's all I got. Like I said, forgive me for the repetition. I hope you've enjoyed. I certainly did. I will be seeing you, well, probably whenever you watch my next video. But either way, you guys have a good one.